And as you and I talked about, there are multiple roles of insulin, and this was your sort of paradigm, that the first role of insulin was an autocrine effect in the pancreas, sort of limiting glucose. So why don't you just give people sort of your perspective on some sort of hierarchy. What are the roles of insulin, and where does pushing glucose into cells fall in that hierarchy?
Yeah, so it does do that once the level is high enough. And so I think about insulin as it tours through the body. Like, where does it, if it's produced normally in the pancreas, where does it go first? And then what does it do? And in that order. So as soon as it's released in the pancreas, it acts to inhibit the release of glucagon, as long as the pancreas is insulin sensitive. And glucagon, obviously, being part of the signal telling you to break down tissue and activate gluconeogenesis in the liver. And so it does that, it suppresses glucagon secretion, and then it goes to the liver, where it alters turns gluconeogenesis on and off. Are you needing to make more glucose or less? And obviously, if you're in a ketogenic state, you will need more gluconeogenesis, and there is some evidence for that, because you're not getting that carbohydrate in the diet, and so insulin is low, more gluconeogenesis. And then it goes out into the circulation, and the first thing that it does is to suppress or be anti-catabolic in the muscle tissue and the adipose tissue. So when you they've done nice studies where you basically inject insulin into like one limb, and then you look at the amount of a substrate coming in and coming out. So at the lower doses of insulin, you reduce circulating fatty acids. So the first thing that it does is be anti-catabolic in the adipose tissue, or start to cause the uptake of fatty acids from the circulation. And then to start finally shoving glucose into cells, you need to increase the dose yet again. So of all the things that insulin does, requiring the highest circulating amount, the final thing is glucose uptake into cells.
And that's what's focused on with the clamp testing. Yeah. And that's, like you said, kind of a myopic, limited model, which excludes all these other functions of insulin and misleads us badly. So the take home here is low-carb ketogenic diets do not make you pathologically insulin resistant. They induce what's called glucose sparing at the level of the muscle, which is a perfectly normal physiologic phenomenon. So if you hear someone say a ketogenic diet makes you insulin resistant, Michael Greger, I'm still waiting for you to show up on this podcast, you fraidy cat. This is not true, and this is normal physiology, and it's very different than systemic insulin resistance. Yeah. So let's talk about what causes insulin resistance. This, to me, is the $64,000 question. Listeners are probably not old enough to know about that show. Basically, this is the $1 million question. That was a show in the game show when $64,000 was actually
a lot of money.
A lot of money, and not just a half of a Tesla or something, like enough to buy like a reasonable car. So how do you think about this? Because what we know is that we do not want to be insulin resistant, pathologically insulin resistant. Yeah. So what causes this?
So I think the cognitive framework that I use, and it's by no means complete, but the cognitive framework that I use is essentially that this is controlled by our adipose tissue. So it's the fat that becomes insulin resistant first. And there are multiple really interesting things that control this. So there is, at some level, a genetic effect or an ethnic effect, because we know that people of different ethnicities can get a certain amount of fat before they become insulin resistant. Caucasians were amazing. We can stuff a whole boatload of fat into our bodies before we get type 2 diabetes.
You mean we can store the fat?
We can store the fat.
Tissue can expand.
Yeah, exactly. And we can get
not dietary fat per se.
No, not dietary. We're talking about how much fat you're storing.
Adipocytes can expand.
Yeah. Right? So Caucasians generally can get the fattest, again, on average, before they become insulin resistant. Whereas people of different, South Asian populations, they can get less fat before they become insulin resistant. And so there's some kind of threshold at which the adipose tissue says, no mas, I can't take any more, and it stops listening to the signal. It becomes insulin resistant. There are modifiers, which is why that is the personal fat threshold is certainly not enough to explain what's going on. And we know from experiments things like metabolic endotoxemia. So if you inject people or mice, rats, humans with LPS, so the endotoxin from E. coli, which we will certainly be exposed to it, if our gut barrier isn't working properly, probably even a little bit after every meal, then chronically you start to see a change in the fat tissue. So there isn't as much of it, but it starts to look like insulin resistant fat tissue, which has a lot more macrophages, a lot more white blood cells. It's a lot more inflamed, and the cells are smaller, but more inflamed, and they're insulin resistant. So if you have anything, I think that's causing a chronic systemic inflammatory state, then that is going to modify how much fat your cells are willing to take up before they start becoming insulin resistant. And you see this in people with different autoimmune conditions. So Sjogren's, rheumatoid arthritis, they are generally not overweight, but they are very insulin resistant. And there's